For joining this session. We've got Dr. Lucky Law, who's going to present for us. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in or come on the mic at the end. Okay, so I'll hand over to you, Dr. Law.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, so let me share my screen. So I just want to check with everyone. Does it look okay on your screen? Do you see any black boxes covering the screen, all that?
Yeah, looks great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, cool. Thanks for attending this talk and good afternoon. My talk title, Partial Least Squares Structural Equation Modeling, bracket PLS SEM for Language Education Research. I am Dr. Lucky Law, Senior Research Assistant / part-time assistant lecturer in CAES Hong Kong U. So this presentation uses example from one of our center's learning transfer project, which is probably the first ever large-scale EAP project that applies this particular PLS SEM structural equation modeling approach. So this presentation has 5 parts, as you can see here on the screen. First, I'll briefly go through what is this, who is this talk for, and then I'll go through the basics of what is PLS SEM, followed by a comparison between PLS SEM and CB SEM. After that, in the section hypothesis design, I'll discuss several key concerns when designing a language education study using PLS SEM, and subsequently when interpreting the results. So let's begin with our first one. Who is this talk? Oh, sorry, that's not the first one. This one. Okay, who is this talk for, and what you can learn from it? So this talk basically targets teachers or researchers who are studious beginners in statistics or experts in confirmatory techniques who know about PLS SEM. Then also those who know PLS SEM but have not applied it in EAP studies. Those of you who are interested in conducting longitudinal or exploratory studies because of the predictive capability of this particular method. I want to learn how to design questions for an EAP study using, of course, the PLS SEM method. For example, how to ask questions that is specific to learned skills. Also, those who are interested in the macro picture of language learning, something that kind of related to Professor Cummings' keynote talk this morning, via the understanding of relationship between constructs and what's happening in the cognitive aspects, for example. Then also those who, for example, researchers who can only collect relatively small samples, let's say 100 or even less. Okay, so that's the first part. Next, so what is PLS SEM? Now, in order to talk about PLS SEM, we have to first cover what is SEM in the first place. So basically, structural equation modeling SEM is the statistical method that allows researchers to incorporate unobservable variables measured directly by indicator variables. So if you look at the screen here, you can see that there are 3 bubbles, pre-state, mid-state, and post-state. And on the left side of the screen, you can see some rectangles in orange, and you can see some of these are statements. So for example, I chose this hotel because it fits my needs. I could relate to the style of this hotel. The hotel was near the top of my wish list. So when you're looking at these statements, you can see that they are, practically or essentially asking or talking about the same thing in various wording, using various wording. So in this part of it, we call it the reflective measurement model. Okay, and if you look at the right side, we have another set of statements, which is the room was comfortable, the staff were friendly, the food was tasty. And now this different set basic, if you look at it, essentially it is talking about, or elements that basically adds up instead of repeating the same statement again in different ways. So these are elements that adds up to what we call the formative measurement model. Now, alternatively, if you look at the indicators, this time pointing to the post day, right, the circle in purple, you can see that I will recommend this hotel to others, and this is what we call a single indicator construct. Finally, if we look at the middle one, we look at the 3 bubbles and the black or gray arrows again. These together, they form the structural model. So this is the basic of what constitutes to an SEM. So knowing all that, we can now talk about what is PLS SEM. So there are 2 types of structural equation modeling. PLS SEM is one of them. The other one is CB SEM. So PLS SEM is a method of the structural equation modeling, which allows estimating complex cause and effect relationships using latent variables. So basically the ones in these circles you previously saw. If you look at the table here, you can see that some of these techniques could be, or probably are very common to, very commonly used, and you might be very familiar with some of them as well. While partial least square is one that is primarily exploratory, and it belongs to the 2nd generation techniques. Okay, and let's move on to our 3rd part. So how are PLS SEM and CB SEM different, and which one should we choose? So if we look at the table here, you can see that PLS SEM is primarily used to develop a theory, whereas the CB SEM, it's primarily used to confirm or reject the theory. And then you have PLS SEM, which basically explains the variance in the dependent variable. So it aims to maximize the R-square values, whereas the CB SEM kind of estimates the covariance matrix for a data sample. And I think one of the most important aspects of the PLS SEM is that it makes no assumption about distribution, whereas the CB SEM kind of expects normal distribution. And this is very important because if you are looking at, let's say, a Likert scale of 5-point or 10-point, and if your cost performance or the ratings that you're getting are mostly on the high end, then using CB SEM may not be a very good way to for the calculation, because it's essentially not normally distributed. Okay, and so there are other aspects of it, but I'll pick the next one. So the next good one actually for PLS SEM is that it easily incorporates reflective and formative measurement models. Just now, you saw in the previous slide. So you have different ways to ask questions, whereas the CB SEM version, you still can do that, but whenever you have formative, you cannot have formative questions alone. You have to, or you must add reflective into it in order to facilitate the calculation. And I think the final point would be the model estimates for PLS SEM generally exhibit higher levels of statistical power than CB SEM. So that's something for you to compare, and not saying which one is superior over the other, but you need to know when to use which one is more suitable for your purpose of research. Okay, so we're moving on to the 4th part, which is hypothesis becoming the design. So here we have the first concern. So basically, when we are using partial PLS SEM, one of the things that we have to first ask is essentially how many of those constructs should there be in the structural model? So the answer would be it depends on the topic that you are interested in, on the scope of your research, and also the definitions that's involved. So for the project that we do in CAS, it's called learning transfer. So really briefly, if you look at the mean / image on the left side. Learning transfer, it's what happens when a student, learns from the teacher and then apply it in a new situation. So I think the grayish cat kind of nicely explain what it is in 3 pictures. For our project, we have 4 constructs. Because the aim was to look at how the current material in the EAP course is helping the students in order to understand, and then after that, how they are applying those skills in other courses. So we then have the construct for transfer and how they apply, and eventually what they consider as their outcome, whether it's a successful outcome or non-successful outcome. So that's why we have these 4 constructs here. But if you are doing a research on some other topic, you probably will have significant difference in terms of the bubbles / construct or latent variables. Okay, so let's move on to the second concern. So how to connect these constructs? Now, if you have your scope definitions, everything settled, then what about the arrows? Now, what is affecting what? Now, again, that depends on the definitions, but also involves the logic in there. Because if you have these constructs, you have these variables, you have to think logically in your mind, obviously, and how and which one is affecting the other. So for our case, we can say that the relevance of the quantity of the learning materials, right, course materials under content relevance will affect the understanding of learning of the students. So we have the first white arrow, and then the understanding of learning will affect the transfer, and so transfer will also affect the outcome. So that's why we have the arrows pointed as such. Could it be the reverse direction? If that doesn't make sense to you, then it shouldn't be like that. One of the suggestion is obviously go to search journal articles in business marketing or human resources development, because these are the key areas where the PLS-SEM is applied, and also in terms of transfer as well. So we have this example. If you take a look at it, it's on the relationship between motivations and transfer. So this is one example here, and then there is also another example. So it's very widely used in business and marketing. So you can see here, this one is on employer attractiveness. So what are the factors, or what are the variables that might affect the employer's attractiveness? Okay, so it can be very complex when using this particular PLS-SEM approach. Right, so we are moving on to concern 3. How many questions to ask for a construct? Now, there are 2 main concerns here. One is the investigator's needs, because for a researcher or an investigator, how many questions one ask? Well, I think most of them will say, well, as many as possible, right? Because I want to know as detailed as it gets. Get as much information from students as possible. But then the problem is, when you want to ask more questions, then there's a possibility of mental fatigue when the students are actually answering them. So the other technical concern is, when you have more questions, then you need a larger sample size. So we need to make sure that you don't ask too many questions, because you don't actually have that many students giving you that minimum sample sizes when they respond. So that's concern 3. And related to concern 4, then, so what is the minimum sample size? Now, actually, there is a software that you can get, you can download for free. It's called G-Power. That you can actually input all these variables and numbers to get an exact value of the minimum sample size. But because here we don't want to go into the very complex detail, I'll just give you this 10 times rule. And what 10 times rule actually says is, when the minimum sample size should be around the maximum number of arrows pointing to a construct times 10. You have to consider that the outer model and the structural model independently. So what happens here is, if I look at the outer model, we have a total of 12 arrows pointing to a construct, right? So if we look at understanding of learning, then there are 12 questions or 12 indicators pointing to that. So which means that this particular model that we use, we have to have around at least 120, because times 10, 120 usable or observable data. Okay, so that's what it looks like, because that is the largest number of arrows pointing to a construct. So let you guys try this one. What is the minimum sample size for this model now? You can take a look, and what do you think? And therefore, what is the minimum sample sizes? Well, if you are looking at the indicators, then you probably see at most 2 indicators, but because we have to consider the model, outer model and the structural model separately. So what happens is we should look at post-term motivation. There are 3 arrows pointing to post-term motivation, and therefore the minimum sample size for this model would be 3 times 10, therefore 30. Okay, so that's that. Okay, and then let's move on to concern number 5. Right, so what questions to ask then? So now that we know, okay, we're going to use reflective constructs, we're going to use formative constructs, what questions should we ask? Well, here is the answer. Basically, when you are going to ask questions of reflective constructs, then these questions should be interchangeable, and there should be maximum overlaps in terms of concepts, whereas the formative construct should avoid overlaps. So you don't want overlapping concepts and ideas, and these questions should add up to form the complete domain as much as possible. So if you look at 2 boxes here, one orange and one blue, can you see which one would be a reflective and which one would be a formative? So the orange box, the skills I have learned in CUE are helpful to my study of Common Core courses. I find the knowledge and skills taught in the CUE relevant to my Common Core courses. So actually the one in the orange box, it's the reflective construct, whereas the formative one, focusing on different skills. So here we have, I have learned how to interpret arguments discussed in academic sources accurately. And also I have learned to search for useful and relevant academic sources online in the library for assignment. Now, the problem is that in language, okay, so hold on, let's look at the chat box. Okay, so the problem is in language education research, especially when you're learning skills involved, it's not easy to avoid these overlaps. And what happens when you're working a formative indicator, if you cannot avoid these overlap, you'll get high indicator correlation, and then the problem will be these questions are going to be very similar. So forget the poll now. Okay, if you look at the blue ones, the blue box here, there are 2 statements. I've used the skills I learned from CUE in my Common Core courses to interpret arguments discussed in academic sources accurately and evaluate criticality, the depth of the arguments of a written work. Now, these 2 questions are very, very similar. So what happens is they're going to be very likely that this will cause some issues in the statistics and numbers. Okay, and finally, we're ending with the final concern. So what software do you use for the calculations? Here it is, very quickly. The Smart POS 3 is the one that I use. Also, for the guidelines, we have the here, the results. that you can get from a publication by myself, Law and Feng, my colleague. And finally, we have the promo here for those of you who are interested in more presentation on the results of this project. It will be P43, okay? Investigation of Hong Kong U undergraduates learning transfer of academic English. So that's all for my talk, basically. Thank you very much. And here are the references.
Thank you very much to Dr. Law. We've got around 4 to 5 minutes for any questions. So feel free to type in the chat or come on the mic if you wish.
I hope I've been on time, because I'm actually having quite a lot of difficulty trying to look at the chat box and presenting.
Yeah, timing was perfectly on time, actually, 20 minutes.
Really cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because I was like, I think it was halfway, and then I saw a message in the chat box says 20. I was like, what? Am I overrunning?
I think that was in response to one of your questions.
Oh, right.
You gave the answer.
Okay,
so,
I see.
Yeah.
I see that one. Okay, sorry about that. That actually scared me. I was like, oh no, it was my own problem. Yeah. Okay. So since you can,
yeah.
still,
So
if you have any questions, you can still
other
ask
questions? I think it would be interesting to get the answers to the results of your data. So you're doing the session tomorrow, is that right?
Yeah. True. Yeah. It's a team effort tomorrow.
Okay.
But in tomorrow's session, I actually don't plan to show the the POS models and the results that much, because we want to focus more on the qualitative aspects of that. Basically, it is really important to have the quantitative data reflecting what it means in a qualitative side, and then together we can look at what innovations in pedagogy. So which is why I want to kind of focus more on the quantity here and quality as in team effort tomorrow, and also what happens after we know these results, how we improve our teaching. Yeah.
Okay.
So
sounds great. I think it's really valuable, to know what we're teaching is transferring into students' assignments.
Yeah, and in this presentation, I kind of want to promote this this modeling method, because I suppose the CBSEM, which is like covariance based approach, ANOVA and all those techniques that are very commonly used, are in many ways problematic, because, for example, like I previously mentioned, the lack of normal distribution, because when you have very high performing courses, teachers are getting very high ratings on the far end, 80%, 90%, or if you like, in a 5-point Likert scale, you get 4 point something. That's no way normal. And if you don't have a normal distribution and you use those confirmatory methods, your calculation is going to be skewed. Therefore, you can say, significance level, whatever all you want, but you're doing all that calculation based on something that's not valid. And that's problematic, which is why the POS-SEM model, mostly on exploratory, but it doesn't have the distribution model problem. It does, because it doesn't assumes any distribution, which is why it's better, and it's better for for us who are running exploratory tests or studies.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not giving a lot of information on how to look at the.
We've got one question from Gavin, and we've just got enough
we do.
time.
Oh, nice.
One
Let me
more
see.
minute if
Yeah,
we can
great.
finish in a minute.
Yeah, that's a good question. Does this model work with categorical data? The thing about categorical data is that you're counting, right? Basically, so it depends on what kind of things you're counting, and surely categorical data can be in some sense quantified into maybe a scalar or ordinal way, but you have to do the conversion obviously in some way before you can put them into SEM. So if you think about SEM in general, basically, I think the simplest way is to look at Likert scale. So you have 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 or 1 to 10, and then if you are, if this is a survey, then it would be like on one end it would be very strongly disagree, sorry, and then on the other end will be strongly agree. So you have to come up with something like that, or numbering. You have to assign certain numbers before it works. So you have to do conversion yourself, but you cannot just purely put the raw categorical data into the system, because this is kind of based on regression. So counting itself doesn't really regress in a sense.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Cool.
So yeah, I'll end the session there. So thank you to Dr. Law.
Thank you everybody for attending.
The presentation, and we'll end things there. So thanks everybody.